Let's keep right on rolling. Last video was pretty fun, and obviously I want to keep going with this series about my favorite games of different years and eras of gaming, so we're going to move right along. I'm not going to spend as much time on the intro this time because you can just watch my video on my favorite game of the 80s to, not game, games. There were multiple games. I'm already messing up. You can go watch that video if you want to understand how this video is going to work. But I will introduce one thing really quickly before we get into the video proper. I mentioned this at the end of the last video, but the title might look a little weird, and yes, I am dividing my videos on the 90s into two parts. One part, obviously the early 90s, and the second part being the latter half, for a couple reasons. One, it's just merely that the 90s, there's just more for me to talk about as far as actual game releases than there were in the 80s. But also because, well, I wasn't necessarily alive for all of the 90s, I'm a 98 baby, but it's my understanding that the early half of the 90s and the latter half of the 90s looked very different as far as gaming was concerned, because obviously the 90s were when we saw one of the greatest technological leaps in gaming history, so I figured it would be better for me to just divide them in half, that way the video wasn't like an hour long, and also just because there's a slight difference between the first half and the second half. So, now that I've blabbered enough, let's jump in. Welcome back to I Want to Talk About, the series where I take a topic, I sit on camera, and I blabber about it. And as you can tell from the title, today I want to talk about my favorite games of 1990 to 1994. So obviously you know how this is going to go. I'm going to introduce the era of gaming a little bit, talk about some 7 out of 10 games in my opinion that just missed the cut of either of my two proper lists, and then I will get into those lists. The first will be the cream before the crop, which were the games that I would personally consider like an 8 or 9 out of 10 on my scale, and then my proper best list, which would be the games or game, it could be either, who knows, that I would give a 10 out of 10 to. So, on to the video and on to the topic at hand, the first half of the 90s in the video game landscape. Once again, I wasn't alive at this time, so I've kind of had to learn through a lot of the research that I've done of video game history, but the early half of the 90s, we were still in the 2D era of gaming. Specifically, we had the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or the Super Nintendo or Super NES, whichever one you want to call it, where we had moved from 8-bit gaming to 16-bit gaming, so visuals were slightly more detailed, more colorful, things like that. And it was in this era that we were starting to see the earliest hints of 3D gaming. Of course, a lot of it was very primitive, and I'm sure if you go back to look at these early examples of 3D gaming that we saw on some games that we'll be talking about later on this list, you might look back and go, oh, that was the standard at the time? But yes, what 3D gaming looked like in the 1990s was the standard. I know this is going to be a very specific thing that I bring up, and it's not going to be necessarily related to video games, but hear me out here. CGI animated movies that were animated in 3D weren't really available until the back half of the 80s, thanks to Pixar, largely. And Pixar's earliest films were short films, so by the time the 90s rolled around, 3D animation was only really in the most primitive stages. Just as a concept, the idea of 3D animated anything was kind of still early on. We hadn't gotten a proper CGI animated feature film until 1995 with Toy Story, of course. And obviously, if films couldn't quite get to do 3D animation just yet, gaming was still going to be in a pretty primitive state with it as well. So things like this, because this is a game I'm not necessarily going to be talking about in this video, something like Star Fox being 3D was the standard of the time because, well, the technology just wasn't quite there yet. This was the best that it could do. And with the 90s, we also started to see one of the bigger trends in the marketing world of gaming, specifically with the battle between the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. Obviously, these were competing platforms. Sega basically was coming into the game as Nintendo's first real competition after the huge success of the NES, and Nintendo responded in kind with the SNES, and the marketing campaigns would often kind of go at each other. There was obviously the big viral Sega Genesis marketing campaign, Genesis Does What Nintendo Don't, where they really heavily established that they were better than Nintendo and they were the console to buy. And while the Nintendo marketing did also go back at it, I think more people tend to remember, at least as far as the battle itself and the marketing, they might remember the Genesis does what Nintendo don't think a little bit more. And even though I would say the SNES won in the long run, both as far as sales and also general community reception, given that a lot of people heavily acknowledge that the SNES is perhaps the greatest console ever created, the Genesis represented a huge ideological shift in gaming at the time. Previously, especially with the NES, the gaming landscape was seen as being something that was just for kids. Video games were kind of seen as no different than that of toys. As a matter of fact, when the NES was coming out, Nintendo had to bundle it with the Rob accessory, an accessory that pretty much worked for about 2 or 3 games, and worked is kind of being generous because from what I understand, it barely worked. But they kind of had to do this as a Trojan horse because in the wake of the video game market crash, people were not really willing to buy a new video game console because they thought gaming was just a fad at the time, so they had to bundle it with Rob to make it look like it was a toy of some kind that you could buy for your kids. Merry Christmas, here's your new toy. So gaming was seen as kind of a kid's medium, but the Genesis was the first console to kind of come along and appeal more to a slightly older audience, more specifically teenagers. I do remember, at least from some of the marketing that I would see in researching the era of gaming, especially for this video, one of the big things that the Genesis had in its corner was sports games, for example. And I know that's just one genre, but that's one way that gaming was kind of moving beyond just being a thing for kids. And the Genesis was a big part of that. Also, this isn't something I really am going to talk super deep about, but one big thing that we started to see in the 90s, even though it technically was in 1989, was the release of the Game Boy. While I'm personally not the biggest handheld gamer, I feel like I have to give credit to the Game Boy, especially because it pretty much revolutionized handheld gaming in the 1990s. The ability to take your video games on the go with you anywhere was pretty significant and fantastic, even if, of course, trying to play a Game Boy today in its original form is going to be a tough time. But it still was a pretty big deal and obviously further helped change the landscape of gaming at the time. And don't worry, in later videos I will bring up certain handheld platforms because even though I'm not the biggest handheld gamer at this point in my life, I'll still bring them up. It's still an important thing to talk about. So that's kind of what the early 90s looked like as far as just the landscape of gaming, but what about the games themselves? Well, that's what I'm here for. I'm here to give you my personal lists of the games that I enjoyed the most from the early 90s. As I said, there are going to be 2 lists in this video. One that I call the cream before the crop, which is games that I personally enjoyed enough to consider like an 8 or 9 out of 10. And then the proper best list with games that I personally gave a 10 out of 10 to. Again, I'd argue I'm a bit nicer when it comes to my number ratings, so there's going to be a lot to talk about throughout this series. In my last video, I did also do a little part where I brought up some 7 out of 10 games that just missed the cut. And I think I'll do that again here because there are still some games that I enjoyed from that era that I didn't necessarily love. And they are some games that are relatively significant either personally or just to gaming as a whole. But there's 3 here. The 3 1990 to 1994 games that were like 7 out of 10s to me that just missed the cut. One of them was the Simpsons arcade game, which is just a game I feel is personally significant to me because it's a game my brother and I dumped a lot of quarters into back in the day in the arcades, and we still actually have it on the PlayStation 3 when it was briefly available for purchase through the digital stores. And it's an enjoyable game, but one that's definitely dated and repetitive in several ways. And throughout this video, we're going to be talking a lot about Sonic the Hedgehog because that's a franchise that obviously was huge in the 90s, and there are a couple Sonic games that I enjoyed, but maybe not as much as some others did. One of them being Sonic the Hedgehog CD, or just Sonic CD, which is fun and enjoyable on a smaller scale, but not a game that I can consider the most essential in the series, and perhaps most unpopular in my opinions here, as a game that I gave a 7 out of 10 to. I'm not as crazy as everyone else is about Sonic 3 and Knuckles. It's very beloved, yes, and I see why, but I just personally didn't necessarily see it as a huge evolution of the formula when I did play the game. I just thought it was another version of the formula, and one that attempted to go into the bigger equals better direction, which is a direction I sometimes begrudge in games. It's still a game I enjoy, but I'm just not as crazy about it as some other Sonic games, and we will see throughout this series that I have some unpopular takes when it comes to Sonic. Some games I don't enjoy as much as others, and some that I enjoy way more. You'll see when we get to those. Also, I know what you're thinking. Why did I talk about Sonic CD and Sonic 3 first? Well, hold your horses. We'll get to that. Promise. I mean it. So, let's get into the cream before the crop. Some great games from the 1990s, the early 1990s specifically, that are probably about 8 or 9 out of 10s on my scale, that maybe aren't my all-time favorite games, but games I still greatly enjoy. Starting off, a game that I only really just got into kind of recently as I've gotten older and gotten more into puzzle games, and maybe it's not going to be that surprising to hear me bring this one up given that I talked about Tetris in my last video, but I gotta give a shout to Dr. Mario. This is another puzzle game that's very easy for me to get addicted to. It kind of seems like after Tetris, everyone was really trying to jump on the puzzle game boat to try and see if they could ape that game's success. And the answer was no, you couldn't. Tetris was a cultural phenomenon and still kind of is, and it's a game that's really hard to top and become bigger than as a puzzle game. But if nothing else, at least Dr. Mario managed to succeed as far as bringing its own unique take to the formula. To me, I think matching the colors of pills to get rid of viruses added a little extra layer of challenge that helped this stand out in a much bigger way compared to Tetris. And like in my last video when I was talking about Tetris, while writing the script for this video, I took a break from writing to play some Dr. Mario, and I didn't want to stop. I may have also nearly given myself some RSI in the process, but nevertheless, I was enjoying myself. I alluded to this game in my last video. In fact, I straight up brought it up by name because it was actually released in some areas in 1989. But yes, you do not need to remind me that Super Mario Bros. 3 is an amazing game. It's not my personal favorite 2D Mario game, but it is an incredibly fun platformer that really helped to define a lot of the conventions that would later become commonplace in other 2D Mario games. It was the game that let people know who the Koopalings were, introduce them, and it also was the first big Mario game to have an overarching, interconnected world map, which is something that we've seen in many other games in the franchise since. Super Mario Bros. 2 USA, which I didn't mention in either video really, was a bit of a roadblock for the series, but with Mario 3, Nintendo was able to kind of like drive around the roadblock and just keep pushing forward. In a lot of ways, you can even see Mario 3 as kind of like a trailblazer for the platformer genre as a whole, because a lot of those conventions that it defined for the Mario series would also become noteworthy staples of other platformers as well. I do personally think that World 8 did drag at some points for me, but otherwise, yeah, Super Mario Bros. 3 is an incredible game, and I also wish Karibo's Shoe came back in some other 2D Mario platformers. Just saying. See, I told you we talk about Sonic 1 and 2. This was the beginning of what would be one of the biggest franchises in gaming, and one of the biggest deals in gaming at the time, with Sonic basically serving as the first real rival to Mario. While the Genesis was succeeding with those older audiences, Sega really needed a character to come along and kind of be their Mario, and Sonic was that. And at the time, Sonic was different from Mario because he was cool and radical. I regret that you had to see me say cool and radical while holding up this hand sign, but it kind of makes sense. Sonic was, you know, the badass dude with an attitude that basically led to a lot of other mascot characters in gaming trying to be badass dudes with attitudes and being talking animals with attitudes. And yeah, while Sonic might be a franchise that some people laugh at today, back in the 90s, it was iconic and beloved, and everyone was all over it. And the original Sonic still stands as a strong platformer. Not only did it stand out in its own way from Mario with its sense of speed, but it also brought some clever level design and greater amounts of freedom compared to other 2D platformers. Compared to a game like Mario, which had a largely straightforward path, Sonic was a game that basically allowed players to kind of branch out and go through other different pathways, and that was pretty unique and cool, especially for its time, I'm sure. It does show some of its age in pockets, but it's still a supremely enjoyable game, though I do definitely prefer Sonic 2 over Sonic 1, even though I don't necessarily think Sonic 2 is a massive jump from the first one. To be fair, with my hot takes on 2D Sonic, it may help that I played Sonic Mania before every 2D Sonic game save for the first one, so some of the groundbreaking things that Sonic 2 or 3 may have done might be a little bit lost on me because I had already played them in a later game first. The whole Seinfeld is unfunny trope that you hear about. But nevertheless, Sonic 2 offered up more varied gameplay compared to the first one. It introduced the spin dash, and after having some problems in the first game with the speed mechanic, where I felt like some levels didn't really reward speed as much as it rewarded careful platforming, they refitted a lot of levels in Sonic 2 to benefit speed a lot more, which was nice. And Sonic 2 was also the game to introduce my favorite Sonic character, Tails. So I gotta give it some credit there, that's some great news. And yeah, even if I'm not as crazy about 2D Sonic as I am about 3D Sonic, I can acknowledge and appreciate that these are very good games. And they're pretty much classics of that era that I think everyone should experience at least once. Just like this one, the classic, iconic, legendary first-person shooter that basically defined the entire genre and became the grandfather of the FPS along with Wolfenstein 3D. The original Doom still remains an incredibly fun game to play today, even though several games have come along since it, a few of which I believe have surpassed it. The original remains very inventive and fun to play now. It's still tight and memorable with great level design and solid controls, and to some, with what we have from Doom now, it might only be worth a revisit for the historical aspect, but honestly, as someone that just likes gaming history, sometimes that's a good enough reason to go back, just to appreciate the history. And even without the history part of it, the fast-paced, adrenaline-induced action is still rip-roaring to this day, and I think that classic Doom has aged more than well enough to be worth your time today. I may not be crazy about some of the sequels that immediately followed it, but the original is still a rip-roaring great time that I think everyone should try out at least once. See what I mean when I say the 90s were super important to gaming? Because we have another game right here that was massively influential, so much so that half of the name of an entire genre, Metroidvania, comes largely from this. Even if it wasn't the first in the series, it's the one that really helped influence the genre. Super Metroid remains a great game to this day as well. You might be surprised though that it's honestly not even my personal favorite 2D Metroid game, but that's honestly just a testament to how good this series is. It might also help that I played 2 Metroid remakes before this one, so that might cloud my judgment a little bit, but nevertheless, this is still an incredible game. The insane amount of exploration in each level is fantastic. The dark, moody atmosphere is created with such detail that's still easy to appreciate today. And I think this game deserves a lot of credit for being an early and amazing example of show don't tell storytelling in gaming. It's a really smart approach, and I think that's an approach that a lot of the best games in the Metroid series have continued to follow, where some of the weakest ones tend to be the tell, don't show type stories. But Super Metroid did a really good job with it back in the day. And even if there are a few games in the series that I prefer, Super Metroid is still one of the most important games ever made, and it's a damn good one. And lastly, in our cream before the crop, another game that back in the 90s felt like a giant paradigm shift for gaming. Donkey Kong Country was seemingly one of the first major games that heavily relied on pre-rendered 3D graphics. In a lot of ways, I feel like you can look at this as one of the first big examples of a 2.5D platformer. And in and of itself, that's a huge technological leap forward, but groundbreaking visuals aren't what keeps a game alive. Great gameplay is. And it turns out that beyond its industry-shaking visuals, Donkey Kong Country is still an incredibly fun platformer to this day. The run and jump platforming is still sublime and controls excellently, the depth of collectibles is incredible, and the level design is impeccable. I should also say that the original Donkey Kong Country trilogy features some of my favorite video game music ever. David Wise is a genius composer, and his work in these games remains tremendous, which is something I will repeat later on in this series. Don't you worry. This is another classic game that, while obviously worth playing for the historical aspect, is also fantastic just as a game on its own. Another one of those games that I feel like everybody should play at least at one point in their lives. But amidst all these excellent history-making games and revolutionary titles, there is still one game from the early 90s that stands above all of them in my opinion, and this is where we get to the best list, which is just one game that I gave a 10 out of 10 to from the early 90s, but this game, even amidst all the history that was being set and landmarks that were being made, and I don't know if I worded that right, but all the crazy innovation that was being seen in the early 90s, there is still one game from that period that to me stands tall as the best game of the first half of the 1990s. And if you know me and you know my love of this series, you're not going to be surprised when I say what it is. My favorite game from 1990 to 1994, how could it be anything other than Super Mario World? I mean, come on, I love this series. Are you surprised that I love this one the most? And no, Super Mario World may not have been the massive revolution that games like Super Metroid or Donkey Kong Country were, or as a game I didn't talk about, it might not have been as convention-setting as a game like The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, but there's one thing I feel like Super Mario World is, and that's timeless. It's not my #1 favorite game in the franchise or of all time. But I will go on record and say that when it comes to the idea of a perfect video game, when I get asked, what do you think a perfect video game is? Often it's Super Mario World that's the first game that pops to my mind. Because I don't think there's really any piece of art or media that's necessarily perfect. There's always some kind of critique that you can give. But to me, Super Mario World is among the closest I think we could ever get to having a truly perfect game. I feel like this game shows what I love about Nintendo, and it's the fact that as much as they revolutionize and innovate and do all these crazy things, even when they're not doing that, Nintendo just has a knack for polishing their games to hell, because oh my god, is this game so unbelievably polished. It is by far the smoothest 2D Mario game in the series thanks to its incredible controls, phenomenal level design, fantastic non-linear overworld map and hidden content, and the absolutely beautiful visuals. I think I'd even argue that to me, amidst all the realism and increases in visuals that we have seen in the industry today, I would still say Super Mario World is, to me, the most graphically impressive and graphically beautiful game that I've ever played. I feel like it's one of those games I could just stare at for hours and just still be absolutely floored by it. Even though the game is now well over 30 years old, it's still a game that visually just blows my mind. And to think that's basically a game that was just working with the limitations of the time. It was also the game that brought Yoshi into the Mario series and had him be playable, and that's awesome. Again, this is one of those games I feel like everyone should play, and as I said, it's as close as I can think of to there being a perfect video game. And again, with how much I just gushed about it, would you believe that there are games in the Mario series I actually like better than this? Yeah, there are, but don't worry, we'll save those for another day. So yeah, those are my favorite games of the first half of the 90s. It's funny, because even writing this script, I was thinking about like, wow, these games were so revolutionary and they're still fun to play today. But just now talking about them, like saying all this stuff out loud, I think it made me kind of appreciate that era even more. Even as an era that's kind of before my time, because I was pretty much born in 3D in the gaming landscape, there were still a lot of fantastic titles. And a lot of the games that I love and the franchises I love, even if the games that I brought up today might not be my favorites in the series, we might not have gotten my favorites in the series if not for the things that these ones did. And those revolutionary, innovative elements would basically become commonplace, and that's just kind of fascinating. And it's nice to see that those games are still fantastically enjoyable to this day. You kind of see why, as I mentioned at one point in the video, people consider a console like the SNES to be perhaps the greatest of all time. It may not be my #1 favorite, but I certainly see why it's everyone else's. But anyway, all that is just my opinion, all my favorite games of the early 90s. What are your favorites? What are the games you played the most? Were you more on the Genesis or the SNES when you were a kid? I know I asked that at the end of the last video, but I'll ask it again here. Which side were you on? What are the games you have the most memories with, that you've played the most, the games that are your favorites? And since I asked something like this at the end of the last video, I'm gonna do it again for this one to prepare you guys for the next video, but where did you stand in the 3D era of gaming? Were you more team PlayStation? Were you team Nintendo 64? Were you team Sega Saturn? Were you someone who actually had a Saturn? Were you somehow able to afford a 3DO? Because we're not going to really talk about the 3DO or the Atari Jaguar in the next video, but Were you able to afford a 3DO? I have to ask because that thing was like $700 in the 90s. That would be like well over $1,000 today. But either way, in terms of the 3D console war, which side did you sit on? Whatever your thoughts, opinions, and experiences are, leave them down in the comments below. Let's keep this civil and have some fun as we like to do. If you guys want to hit like and subscribe and support some of my other ventures that I have linked in the description, thank you. If not, it's no big deal. I totally understand. And yeah, the next video in this series is going to be the last one that's going to be based around multiple years as opposed to just 1 year, but it's going to be my favorite games of 1995 to 1999. We're getting into the 3D era now, and there's going to be a lot of games I'm going to be really excited to talk about in that video. There was a lot I was excited to talk about here, and as we get into that video, there's going to be even more to talk about. So stay tuned for that, but until then, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.